Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In the interests of keeping to the Brookings schedule, we're going to start our final panel session of the day. For anyone who wasn't here at 9 o'clock when we started, when I last spoke, it feels like a lot longer than 9 o'clock this morning to someone who flew across the Atlantic yesterday. My name's Andrew Lazard. I work at RUSI, a London-based research institute and think tank where I head up the work on national security. And it's my privilege, and I know it's a cliche to say it's a privilege to be chairing a session, but looking at the cast of terrorism experts on my left, it really is a privilege to be chairing this session in which we are going to be looking at the future of technology and terrorism. This is labelled a policy panel, so I'm hoping that we're going to be talking about some of the policy implications as well, and not just, if you like, speculating about the future. But let me introduce our three panelists. Collectively, their pedigree in terrorism studies is so impressive. I could probably spend the next hour and a quarter that we've got scheduled for this session just talking through lists of their achievements. So I'm going to be very brief, and I'm sorry if I miss out some of the things that you're most proud of. But to start alphabetically, at the other end, we have Professor Mia Bloom. I'm sure Mia is extremely well known to many, if not all of you in the room. Mia is Professor of Communication and Middle East Studies at Georgia State University, and has written a number of, I think it'd be fair to describe as groundbreaking books on suicide terrorism, Dying to Kill from 2005, on women and gender in relation to terrorism, which was Bombshell from 2011, and she also has a new book. It's so new that I think we were amongst the first people to see it this morning at breakfast, which is on children and terrorism. It's called Small Arms. So I think from those three titles, Dying to Kill, Bombshell, and Small Arms, you can probably tell that if nothing else, Mia is the preeminent terrorism expert in terms of coming up with very clever titles for her research. To my immediate left is William Braniff, Bill Braniff, who is Director of the National Consortium for the Study of Terrorism and Responses to Terrorism, known as START. If you're in the field of terrorism research and you've not come across START, then I'd suggest you've got probably a long way to go, and is also a Professor of the Practice at the University of Maryland. And prior to START, University of Maryland, Bill was at CTC, the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point, which is an extremely important, well-known institution. And then finally, in the middle, Colin Clark, who's a Senior Research Fellow at the Soufan Center, and is an Assistant Professor at Carnegie Mellon University. And prior to those institutions, Colin spent nearly a decade working at the RAND Corporation. Colin's also the author of some very significant volumes. Terrorism, Inc., The Financing of Terrorism from 2015. Terrorism, The Essential Reference Guide from last year, and also has a new book this year. Not out just yet. Oh, it's out in the UK. Okay, so next month here, already in the UK, after the Caliphate, the Islamic State, and the terrorist diaspora. So I'm going to start with an easy question. They are going to get more difficult, which is simply to offer some reflections on what you've heard today. And I understand, Mia, that you might have a few slides to start us off with.
Wait a second, I want to take a picture. So I promised my publisher that I would promote the book. And I will say that the book that is going to be coming out next year with Brookings is on women in jihad. It's called Veiled Threats. So there's the fourth one. So one of the things that just happened coincidentally a few weeks ago, and Audrey was there with us, we had a conference on the future of technology and terrorism. And we explored some of the issues that are emerging, not just in terms of ISIS, but globally across a variety of terrorist groups, and they all have really important policy implications. It's important that we understand the power of social media and the ways in which, and of course this is focused on ISIS, but the ways in which terrorist organizations create these relatable narratives or their memes in order to target the population that they're most interested in recruiting. And so what they will do is they will exploit certain images or certain ideas or concepts that people can relate to. So for example, if you're reading Rumiya or Dalbec, what you're going to notice is 1/3 of the content everyone's going to agree with. It's logical. 1/3 of the content is a little bit more extreme, and then 1/3 of the content is to recruit you into the most extreme. But they need to start with this baseline in order to get you at least agreeing in part, so that, for example, no one in the room is going to think that it's okay for Uyghur Muslims to be in concentration camps. No one in the room is going to think that it's okay for Rohingya Muslims to be killed. So they'll start with something that people can relate to. Because they were targeting a particular population, they used memes from Call of Duty. And again, what they would say is they would use, and I had to ask my students because I don't play Call of Duty, so what is respawn? So apparently it's being born again. So this idea of you will play a real life Call of Duty and respawn in Jannah, which is heaven. Now, the importance of understanding why we're having conversations like this today is to see how these issues go from social media. For example, this is Khalid Sharif's son, at the time 7 years old, holding a severed head. And it went from Twitter to print media within hours to the television within an hour, a few hours later. So these things definitely, they go viral, but they don't, we talked about cross-platform, they don't just stay within social media. And they become then the conversation of the day, the month, the hour. And that then has a huge influence in the ways in which the groups not just project their power, but the way we understand what these groups are capable of doing. Now, the reason this is also relevant, policy-wise, is because both the Sharif parents are dead. I documented it in the book. And what happened was Tara Nettleton died of an appendicitis. Khalid Sharif died apparently twice. It's amazing. He did respawn, but he died. The first was an exaggeration. His death was exaggerated. But the second time, he's definitely dead. But now there's 5 kids in refugee camps that are trying to get back. And there's a grandmother in Australia, Karen Nettleton, who wants to bring them back. And in fact, I think BBC Four Corners has been following the story. So these issues are not just about cross-platforms and memes and things going viral, but it's also about what are the policy decisions that Western countries and even countries within the Middle East are going to have to debate and consider as we move forward. How do we save the kids? Are the kids, can we save them? And what would be necessary to do so? Now, it's also important, as we talked about earlier today, and I promise you that Isra had these yesterday. I didn't put them together at the last minute. But we talk about the offline as well. And this is examples of when ISIS was at its height in 2015 and 2016, the ways in which it was able to take what it was producing that we saw online and social media, both in the open API platforms as well as in the semi-encrypted space. What they would do is generate offline propaganda and just distribute it. So Al-Naba, which is generally comes out on Tuesday, started out as a paper newspaper. Now it's online, but it was something that they could go from place to place and disseminate their ideas and their material. But this is how ISIS envisions itself for the future. It very much, again, relatable memes to the Terminator, which is one of the reasons we called our conference T2, and also Audrey said I was a science fiction geek, which is true as well. But you see, this is how they're seeing themselves. They are seeing themselves that they are going to be implementing robots and AI, and they're not. They are adapting drones and they are using different technologies, but this is not it. And this is my favorite when we talk about the research. I woke up one morning and I had a bunch of text messages. They had doxed me. They had decided that apparently I'm not slave market material, which I thoroughly disagreed. But apparently, and what amused me is that I'm sitting in front of about $10,000 worth of Pappy Van Winkle, and it says bourbon lover, but they decided to cross out terrorism expert and say alcoholic anyways. So I think it's important that although I did this for a little bit of levity and it was at the end of the day, it's important that we understand that there are risks and there are responsibilities in conducting this kind of research. As we look inside ISIS, we do see certain things that would surprise us. For example, at the height of their power, as much as 45% of their propaganda on any daily basis might have been very positive messaging. We are inoculating the sick, we're feeding the poor, we're distributing free food during Ramadan for the Eid. So I think that a better understanding also can inform policy with regard to how are we going to understand the messaging for the next group, the group that potentially replaces ISIS, or how can we use Telegram to anticipate its next move? When I was debating Sebastian Gorka in 2016, and Defense DIA asked us, where next? And he said Saudi Arabia, and I said the Philippines. And I think Southeast Asia definitely is now where we've seen the movements. And in terms of the whack-a-mole aspect of it, I think we have to understand that it's something that came up today in the first session, which I thought was fantastic. The regional perspective allows us to understand that what ISIS is doing is very much that Al-Qaeda model that it created years ago, the franchising model Bruce Hoffman talks about, that they are lomming onto local grievances in order to insinuate themselves with the population because they are still about hearts and minds. And so I wanted to just present that as food for thought, and that as we are looking at the way in which ISIS has metastasized, it has really gone from being its territorial caliphate to being the virtual caliphate. And thank you so much for sitting through another set of slides. I hope the last one at least made you laugh.
Thank you. Colin.
Thanks so much for sticking around, and thank you very much for the invitation. This is actually my first time at Brookings, so I'm really excited to be here. It's been an excellent conference and a great day. I'm going to do two things today that I don't normally do. The first thing is I'm not going to use PowerPoint. At my time at RAND, most of it was spent in the Pentagon, and that's the only way you can actually communicate in the Pentagon. By PowerPoint. And the other, so I've escaped the tyranny of PowerPoint, and it's actually quite liberating. And the other is that I'm going to jump around a little bit to a few different topics and not focus just on one thing. They're going to be related to technology and terrorism and counterterrorism, but my hope is to spark debate and questions. So not that I'm deliberately trying to be provocative, but I want to talk about some things that I find really interesting. So the first is a question I get all the time from my work on terror financing, which is why don't we see more terrorists using emerging technologies in their operations, things like Bitcoin? And I think, and I was speaking earlier with Florence, one of the reasons is we're going to see that when we see more people in everyday society using this more, right? And so these trends will parallel each other when we have more frequent use in everyday society. In effect, that increases the volume of transactions, which helps terrorists, that provides cover to mask in with the other, with the other transactions. I think the first place where we might see this, the terrorists adopting the use of technology is in the area of drones, right? And so I'm working on a project right now with David Gartenstein-Ross, where we're looking at terrorist use of drones. It's been a fascinating couple of months. And we've talked about things like UTM, which is unmanned traffic management. And so in 3 or 4 years, when it's normal to get an Amazon delivery by drones, and you have these things buzzing above your head, that's when we're going to see an increased use. We have seen, obviously terrorist groups using these already. A lot of it tends to be clickbait, right? Like ISIS weaponized drones. It's them dropping a grenade, which is not to say that it's trivial, but okay, they didn't weaponize drones in the way that the article leads you to believe. And obviously I clicked on it because I'm a sucker, right? But I had to see for myself. But the other thing I'll say on virtual currencies, and my friend, good friend and colleague Patrick Johnston has written about this in his own research, is that most types of virtual currencies offer only limited anonymity. It's difficult to quickly transfer large amounts of money through these systems. And there's limited acceptance of digital cash in regions such as the Middle East and North Africa, where many terrorist groups are active. That said, we shouldn't be narrowly focused on jihadist groups, right? We need to look at how other terrorists are adopting technology, including violent white supremacists, who have already been using virtual currency to fund sites like the Daily Stormer when that was active. And so I'd be very curious, and I've been talking to Jason Blazakis about this, about movement in that area. I think it's too easy to beat up on tech companies for not doing enough, but we should also give credit where credit's due. And I think Aaron's gone, but I wanted to give a shout out to my friend Brian Fishman for his excellent essay in the Texas National Security Review, which if you haven't read, I urge you to. I spent time in Afghanistan with Brian. We sat next to each other when we were working for H.R. McMaster, and I got to know him really well. And so when he got that position at Facebook, I was relieved because I know that he's a really smart guy, and I know that he's trying really hard and he means well. So we have to give a little bit of the benefit of the doubt in that respect. And we have to do more as researchers, right? It's not just, hey, tech companies do more, right? We have to assume some of the responsibility and to make tailored recommendations toward that end. I think we focus too much on the advantages offered by terrorists by emerging tech and not enough of the advantages for states, right? So we're constantly looking at red, not enough at blue. States, particularly in the West, have been able to harness emerging tech to harden borders and make it more difficult for returning foreign fighters to surreptitiously return home, things like biometrics. So there's that. Now, here's where I'll go into state use of technology in a nefarious way. Look no further than what China's doing in Xinjiang, right? So China's created this highly controlled environment where it monitors the minority ethnic Uyghurs, relies on emerging tech to track and surveil them. It uses artificial intelligence, biometrics, and a range of other high-tech gadgetry. And China's internal security apparatus closely surveils various segments of the population. If you haven't seen the piece that the New York Times did, it was a video essay called How China Turned a City into a Prison. It's really fascinating and worth 10 minutes of your time. But China's already got over 200 million surveillance cameras and has plans to use AI to help track the movement of its population, as well as monitor internet usage, travel, and personal communications of its citizens. The Chinese government, I think, is calculating that even if its actions do breed resentment, the security state has been so carefully constructed that it'll be sufficient to crush any and all dissent. These methods have grown increasingly harsher over the past several years. Chinese citizens are now required to swipe official identification cards, and security forces maintain vast biometric profiles in electronic databases. You also have compulsory software that's being downloaded on phones and satellite navigation systems installed in vehicles. With handheld devices, Chinese security personnel can scan the phones of citizens to search for encrypted communications or look for any videos that could be considered extremist in nature, right? And that's probably defined pretty loosely. So I'm really concerned about something I've been talking about lately, which is if this model, right, the Xinjiang model, becomes attractive to other authoritarian regimes, and could you see the Chinese exporting this, right? So think about the way the United States and the West does security cooperation and building partner capacity in counterterrorism. We will travel to your country and help you use these systems to defeat Boko Haram, right, and all these other groups. If the Chinese model is perceived as effective by countries like Pakistan or Turkey, or even some non-authoritarian regimes, right? We've seen democracies crack down on social media, right? If this becomes attractive as in terms of I can make a case for reducing terrorism and then maybe winning the next election, maybe I'm more likely to invite the Chinese into my country to help me implement this model. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I'm quite worried about that. And I'll close with the other thing I've been working a lot on, which is a couple of years ago, we were commissioned to do a study on the future of terrorism. And so I've been thinking a lot about what are going to be the ideologies in the future that motivate political violence, right? It's not what we're seeing right now in front of our face. So beyond jihadism, beyond even violent white supremacy, What are we missing? What's percolating under the surface right now that we can't quite grasp yet? And this is related to technology. And so everything that's old is new again. And I think back to Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who some have called a neo-Luddite. And the way that technology has become ubiquitous in our society is going to provoke a backlash. And not only among the kind of get off my lawn crowd, and my dad's probably not watching this, but I consider him, right? So get off my lawn, like technology is everywhere. I just want to do things the way I've always done them. There's that, but people take everything to the extreme. And if there's a perception that artificial intelligence is taking away people's jobs and changing our lives not for the better, you may very well see a backlash with people destroying property or going after tech executives or anything along those lines, right? Whether or not AI actually takes people's jobs away, because I've seen debates on both sides of it, if the perception is there that it is, you might very well see violence following that. And so I'll conclude with that, but those are just some of my thoughts on kind of the future of technology and how do we get ahead of that from a policy perspective. Thank you.
Thanks, Colin. You're going to regret posing that question, which I noticed you didn't answer, about what are the ideologies going down the track. So I'm going to ask you and other panelists to answer that a bit later on. But Bill, have you got any general reflections first?
Sure. Well, first, let me say thank you to the organizers of the conference, and for the record, and for those out in TV land, in no way is START upset that Rusi and Brookings won the solicitation to run the Global Research Network. We are a collaborative bunch, and we're really happy to be here.
That's not what you said earlier.
Perhaps fitting for the last panel of the day, I call the first part of my talk Realistic Expectations of Diminishing Returns. Here are a few reasons why I think we should have realistic expectations of diminishing returns, despite the tremendous strides that have been made over the past 3 or 4 years in this field of tech and terrorism. The first, for those familiar with military history, military studies, the gun armor race. It's really expensive and often reactive to build better and better armor compared to how expensive it is and how quick it is to produce a more and more effective projectile. And not only does this gun armor race, is it problematic if you're on the defensive side, it gets, the delta between the payoff gets worse and worse over time. And we've talked about this a little bit, right? Our adaptive adversaries can take very, very low-cost means to defeat very, very expensive countermeasures. I'm actually concerned that this is problematic in sort of 3 ways. One is just the very nature of the gun armor race that tech companies are fighting. So they've made great strides, but after they've covered this low-hanging fruit, it's going to be harder and harder to have as impressive gains. Second, extremists are like online insurgents. They are fighting a total war, and tech companies are fighting a partial war. They have other more pressing objectives. And so there's a sort of an insurgency challenge here. And third, tech companies, due to market forces, are spending more and more resources actively developing the capabilities to provide better and better privacy, encryption, and capabilities. So collectively, the industry itself is hurtling towards defeating its individual platform countermeasures, potentially hurtling us towards the mainstreaming of things like the decentralized internet, greater options for not just encrypted communication, but encrypted behaviors beyond just financing and promiscuous dating. I'm a huge fan of the GIF-CT, but Aaron mentioned the challenges of herding 14 cats that are actively participating in the GIF-CT already. And so I wonder if 30 or 45 companies actively participating deliver 2 or 3 times the value, or again, if there would be some diminishing returns as that gets more and more difficult to coordinate. Youth involvement, creating intractable problems. I can only imagine that as tech companies seek greater and greater penetration with minors, who represent a greater and greater percentage of sort of the market share of users of these tech platforms, the sticky issues that we've discussed today will only get stickier when we face the reality of 13-year-old white supremacist thread moderators on Reddit and the mobilization of the cubs of the caliphate. You could also call the last panel of the day an effort to say things that have not yet been said, and in doing so, to say more provocative things that you have less confidence in compared to what you would have said earlier in the day. So go easy on me, but here are some potential future negative second-order effects in this policy sphere for us to try to avoid. We actually covered this last one in the last panel, but let me put numbers to it. In the United States, between 2005 and 2017, so over that 12-year span, 87% of active social media users were thwarted before they were able to conduct a successful attack. 87% failure rate, compared to a 47% failure rate for those extremists who were not active on social media. Now, again, this is the pre-prevalence of encryption period of time. But I just wonder if we're going to look back at this same period of time in which extremists were massively exploiting open social media tools and think of it as a golden age of counterterrorism, because it turns out that using the open internet is a wildly stupid thing to do for operational security purposes. To go further, in the aftermath of recent violent far-right attacks in the United States, there's been a palpable excitement about the possibility of getting kicked off of 8chan because it might finally push the movement out of the recesses of the internet and onto the street. My battery just died. The perils of going last on a panel. Yeah. Hold on. I got to back up, sort of. I do have a backup. We'll see. Where was
When the
I?
teleprompter stops working.
Okay, negative second order effects. I'll stop with this last one, I think. The ability for, let me put it this way. Right now, governments and society is putting more and more pressure on Silicon Valley to develop better and better AI, for just an umbrella term, for good censorship. And I wonder how long it is before that technique, developed in Silicon Valley by private sector entities, spills over into the public sector in other countries, and potentially in our country. And in the United States, not such a big deal, right? The United States government doesn't control the best data in the United States. The private sector does. Silicon Valley controls the best data in an AI world. But in an AI-fueled world, or in an AI world, data is the jet fuel. And in other countries, as my colleague just mentioned, the government holds the most and the best data of individual citizens. And when the Silicon Valley technologies bleed over into the public sector in those countries, you can have a really dangerous cocktail, as we've just alluded to. I guess I'll end there, since these notes, I've been adopting my notes all throughout the day, and I don't have them in one place. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Bill. And I'm sure that some of the points that you would have made had your battery lasted, you'll have an opportunity to make a couple of them in a bit of Q&A. So I want to come back to a point that you made, Colin, and ask the whole panel, noting the surprise that there's often out there that terrorists aren't early adopters of some technologies, but they are early adopters of communication technologies, aren't they? And that's one of the reasons why we're sitting here today. So if we take the example of live streaming, I mean, it's an obvious example to take, but Facebook Live was only introduced in 2015. I read a fascinating interview, I think on BuzzFeed, with Mark Zuckerberg, where he said in 5 years' time, video is going to be where it's at. Most of the material shared on our platform is going to be video. And within a few months of that interview, we had an attempt at a live stream terrorist attack in just outside Paris, and obviously the Christchurch attack takes that to another level.
And Bangladesh and the Iranian parliament before that.
Absolutely, yeah.
San Diego,
But he messed it up. He messed it up, which is maybe there's another question we can get into later about like human error and all of this. The question that arises from that then is, if it takes them months to work out how to use a technology or an affordance like live streaming, what are the things that haven't happened yet that the technological environment that we're in today, or that might be just around the corner, what's the next if you like, live streaming type capability that we think terrorists are going to use in terms of communications technologies. I'm not thinking about drones or cyber attacks. We'll come on to cyber attacks in just a second. I'm thinking about communications technology. What's the next thing that you think that terrorists might be looking to use? Bill, you're looking as if are you nodding that you've got an answer?
I do, but I think his button is... So if you think about Islamic State's tendency to hack information online, basically to crowdsource information online using available information on websites and things about the names, addresses, photographs of U.S. service members and their families. Put that in a document, send the URLs to those documents around and have, they get circulated around the internet. An individual in Ohio got 20 years in federal prison for retweeting a hit list that the ISIS's online sort of hacking folks produced. We also know that they produce applications, right? So we can look at the back end of the platforms that they've generated, and they are using their own coders, their own engineers to design their own platforms. How long before we have terrorist-produced platforms that allowed for crowdsourcing of target packages with geolocation? So imagine Yelp for assassinations. I open my application that ISIS has produced. Within a 10-mile radius, here are 10, not random targets for assassination, but targets of strategic value, soft targets of strategic value for assassination that are crowdsourced. You have idiots like me with family who take the first day of school picture, 8:03 a.m., time-stamped, geotagged photograph. You now have the pictures of my children, the pattern of life that you need to know when we leave our house to get to school in the morning. And if I were important, you could conduct a strategic soft target attack, crowdsourced, geotagged, disseminated to the virtual caliphate.
And it's one of the things, Bill's absolutely right. A few months ago, they produced in Telegram, in one of the chat rooms, the route that the Secret Service takes to drop the president's son off at school. And so that and of course, this information was shared with relevant, important people right away. But the idea is not just that they are using, for example, Telegram to demonstrate the live feed, but people are giving them instructions. Oh, shoot that person off to the right, shoot the person off to the left. And it's this weird interactive game where people who are nowhere close to Bangladesh feel like they are participating in this virtual space. And then I can only assume it's sort of that first drug, that first lure of, well, I've done it virtually, now I want to go wherever they are and do it in real time. So it's both the information, it's hacking soldiers' Fitbits, that this information, you can see where they run when they are abroad, but it's also domestically for crowdsourcing, like Bill is saying, so that the kinds of information, whether it's about Prince George in the UK or about the president's children, we have to be aware that they are trying to be what we call malevolently creative. They are trying to get new ideas and new targets, but also ways of making it, in many ways, more addictive for their audience. And it's why they use Telegram. It's why they exploit this issue of fear of missing out. And so, for example, when they advertise a link, if you don't get it in 30 minutes, you don't get access to it. And so this idea of constantly sustaining user engagement, but that eventually you want to take them offline and bring them in person, that I think is the ultimate goal. And making it more exciting and making them feel like they are in these personal shooter games that are going to become a reality, I think is one of the things where it might be going in that direction.
Colin, do you have a view?
Just a different spin on it. I mean, you were talking about communications technology, but I'm thinking about more, propaganda by the deed, right? Every terrorist act is a form of communication. And so there's a range of technologies, not just drones, but a lot, what I've been thinking about lately is additive manufacturing or 3D printing, right? And so how does that change the battlefield, right? We spend so much time trying to disrupt networks, whether that's arms, finances, narcotics, all these things that fund a group. But what if it becomes really easy to print what you need, right? Especially, I'm not even talking about an insurgency, I'm talking about a terrorist attack, right? Which we know is it doesn't take much to do, and we've seen a lot of people experimenting in this space. And if you're able to do that and synchronize attacks and really send a message and communicate that, right? And I think that speaks volumes.
And perhaps staying with you just for a second, Colin. I mean, in the world of crime, in serious and organised crime, we talk about cyber-enabled and cyber-dependent crime. A lot of terrorism, what we're talking about today, is kind of the cyber-enabling element, digitally enabled terrorism. But do you see a significant threat from cyber-dependent terrorism, so effectively terrorists using cyber attacks? I was interested that Bill and Mia both kind of highlighted, if like, hacking as a way to, as a route to creating certain kinds of effect. But do you see terrorists trying to create significant damage through, for example, malicious code?
Yes, but I also see, I look at the combination of cyber and physical, right? So enacting some kind of a cyber attack that actually is just, will distract first responders or distract people to cover for an actual physical attack. So I just don't know that the capabilities are there yet. Although when I see things at the state level, like an Iranian cyber attack on a dam in upstate New York, I think to myself, that's the equivalent of a weapons test, right? They're getting into this network, they're mucking around, and they want to see how long they can stay in there before they're noticed. Because they don't care about a dam, but they care about getting into a network and seeing if they could replicate that in something more serious. That's at the state level. The other thing that I've written about before is I think we've created this situation for ourselves, not only at the non-state actor level, but also at the state level, again, because our conventional military capabilities are so far superior to any near-peer competitors. We've forced them to go the asymmetric route, to say, I'm never going to be able to go toe-to-toe with the United States conventionally, so why don't I dump all of my resources into cyber-enabled capabilities, into hacking, into drones and AI, right? Because the return on investment for them is far greater than they'd get of trying to go conventional.
Just one point in favor and one point against. So the point in favor, it would be somewhat irrational for extremists not to pursue cyber-dependent attacks because, one, if we know that they're pursuing that capability, we have to spend quite a bit on countermeasures to mitigate that capability. And both Al-Qaeda and now Baghdadi have said out, and multiple times, Baghdadi once, but Al-Qaeda for its history, that they're waging a war of attrition, and they want to have us attrit our political, economic, and military will to continue to care about the Muslim world and our engagement in the Muslim world. So the more they can make us spend money, the better for now both of their attrition strategies. And it doesn't matter if they're ever successful. But the reason they should pursue it, they might pursue it, a second reason they might pursue it in that same vein is, unlike CBRN capabilities, which really don't apply to Moore's law in the same way, where the capabilities don't get twice as good and twice as cheap, twice as accessible, in a period of time. The technique for the cyber stuff, it does, right? It's more and more accessible, faster and faster. It's cheaper and cheaper, and you don't need to be an expert to use it. You just have to, insert the thumb drive into the system, et cetera. So it's also more likely that they'll be successful in the cyber realm than the CBRN realm. Yet we have seen them pursue CBRN capabilities, right? And so if they pursued those, I think it would be irrational for them not to. The one point against it, why you might not see it, is that to go back to Alistair's point, which is a point I could hammer on all day long. Terrorism is not about the violence or the damage. It's about the psychological and political impacts of the violence and the damage, or the threat of that future violence. And cyber-dependent attacks, if they don't have that same political and psychological payoff, they may not be worth the incentive of investing in the first place. So it would have to be something that had that psychological and political payoff.
So moving on slightly, Jamie Bartlett, who many of you will know, does a lot of work on a whole range of issues relating to internet, social media technologies. He said recently that we'll look back on this period as a golden age in terms of the relationship between government and the tech sector, because he could foresee a kind of a sort of blockchain-enabled world in the future where it will become more and more technologically different. I suppose this comes back to your point, Bill, about the tech sector making life more and more difficult for itself. Do you see countermeasures developing in a way that will, if you like, keep track of terrorists' ability to use the internet, or do you see us kind of as we're falling behind the curve?
Well, there's two things. First of all, while we were in session, the Washington Post published the story that the United States is not going to be signing on to the Christchurch proposal, which is unfortunate. So as much as Jamie might say that there's a golden age, I think we found a little chink in the chain. But I do see some tech companies that are outside the United States are far less amenable to working with governments. And the one that I'm thinking of in particular, because I work so much on Telegram, and since it's ISIS's preferred platform, is Pavel Durov, who is the originator of the Russian Facebook called VKontakte, and the originator of Telegram. And he has even defied court orders to allow the security services any kind of access, basically saying that he believes in privacy and freedom of speech. So what he has done is he has defied several court orders. This is a huge contrast to what we see in this country in terms of the willingness of the tech sector to at least meet the government halfway. While, and I think Erin phrased it very succinctly when she said there's a tension between security and privacy and freedom of speech, but that Facebook has gone to great lengths to try to balance, for the greater good. But at the same time, we are facing some challenges when politics gets inserted, and that when we start having conversations about definitions of terrorism to focus on one group at the exclusion of another group, when the other group might be responsible for 75% of the attacks. So that, we might be seeing a golden age in some ways, but there are a lot of obstacles that have been placed in our way in terms of having the best possible outcomes.
I suppose the question, though, is will those obstacles become more and more apparent? Will we get more obstacles and they'll become bigger?
We will get more obstacles. Sorry, I should have led with that.
I think it depends, right? I think it depends on what kind of country we're talking about. As I alluded to in my remarks on China, there's no public-private partnership to worry about. It's all kind of one and the same, right? And so there's a lot more leeway. And I think, as I mentioned, I'm very concerned that other states with the ability to do that, right? That's just it's a non-starter for the United States. We're never going to be like that. It's antithetical to our values. But there are countries, even if you look in Eastern Europe where populism is really kind of taking hold, where things could change in the next 5 or 10 years, what if there's some kind of large-scale, and I'm not a fearmonger by any stretch, but think if there's a large-scale WMD attack in any city in the world, right, that a populist leader seizes on as saying, look, to prevent that from happening, here are the measures we need to take. And you could certainly see a lot of people buying into that. I mean, think about the situation here after 9/11. People were a lot more willing to give up their privacy, right, for the promise of security.
I think we've been talking about it. The asymmetries are pretty great, right? It's very hard for large rule-based organizations, which is what a bureaucracy is, so governments, but also large corporations. They're rule-based organizations. Erin's comments, they're not going to make a decision unless it is scalable, transparent, defensible. The extremists don't have any of those same concerns, and so their OODA loop, their ability to exploit and react, is just so much faster. So I think that we're going to make great strides, and then we're going to see a point of diminishing returns, which I've alluded to, and then we're going to see market forces drive us towards what people want, which is greater and greater privacy encryption, and not just encrypted communications, but encrypted behaviors. And that will be wildly empowering for super empowered individuals. And I think the asymmetry works in the favor of individuals in that context, including extremists.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question of the panel, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor. So for those of you who've got questions, start formulating them now into a pithy, concise question. But before we do so, I'd like to come back to this question of what is coming down the line in terms of ideologies. You've had a bit of time to think about this, so perhaps if we start, Bill, with you.
So globally, I think environmental extremism, because the greatest threat and the most widespread grievance that's going to affect the largest number of already aggrieved populations will involve climate issues. And people are starting to get pissed off at the sources of those climate issues and those not doing enough about it, et cetera. In the United States, my greatest concern, I don't know if it's the most likely, but my greatest concern by far is partisan terrorism. And I don't mean violent far-right neo-Nazis. I mean Republican extremists and Democrat extremists, right? That kind, in a two-party system, partisan extremism of that kind is devastating. And in an already polarized society, can lead to massive negative consequences, including just an inability, right? Even if it doesn't reach sort of the sort of civil war worst case outcome, how does a country like the United States compete against a country like China in an AI world if we were at each other's throats? Can't do it. And so just even from a global competitive standpoint, I think that would be devastating for the U.S.
I agree with Bill. I think that we're cognizant of right-wing extremism, but we are been maybe perhaps lulled into a sense that there isn't going to be left-wing extremism, and there very definitely could be. I'm concerned, and it's some work that we're doing with the Anti-Defamation League on toxic masculinity. For me, what just amazes me is how often, regardless of what the nature of the ideology is, there is this inherent violence against women, hatred of women, hatred of groups, hatred of people who are gay. Like, in other words, something that links, whether it's extreme right wing or jihadis or the incel movement. So I'm concerned as well with, and again, not to go too far into science fiction, but we are heading into a world in which women's rights are very much being challenged. And so as this is occurring, juxtaposed with this notion of men's entitlement to women, you have people like Jordan Peterson in Canada, who are the darling of the extreme right wing with his strange philosophy. But I do see this being weaponized and becoming a challenge. In addition, so the worry that I have is not just that it's one ideology, but that we have this competitive environment in which we have multiple ideologies that have weaponized their ideology and a possibility of competition. And my work has always looked at outbidding as a worst case scenario, that if you've got right-wing terrorism and left-wing terrorism, and terrorism that is directed against women, and terrorism about the environment, that in this mix, there is these weird incentives to escalate because they're all going to be competing for the lead story on CNN or Fox News, and they're all going to be competing for recruits and attention.
Yeah, I'd actually echo Bill's comment on environmental, because I think, and I was talking to Michael Brown about this just earlier in the day. I mentioned, backlash against technology, and the other thing I said, if you look what's happening in Europe right now in places like Germany, where kids are staging walkouts in high schools because they think their governments aren't doing enough to address climate change. By the way, could you imagine if those kids went to school here, how they would feel? But if they feel that violence or destroying property is necessary strictly to call attention to the issue because enough isn't happening and they perceive it to be an existential threat, which I think many people do. So I think that's one of them. And then the other, which I've been thinking a little bit about, is kind of violence that's ethnically motivated in this country, but elsewhere, as the balance of power in the world shifts even further. So if China is perceived to be this dominant power, of people in this country turning around and looking and saying, well, why are these people dominating us and being violent against Asians, or as Latinos continue to make up a bigger part of the demographic profile in this country, it's it's always the fear of change and transition and these periods of instability where you see these acts of political violence. And so those are a couple of things. And then there's frankly the things that we just don't know and we haven't thought of yet. And that's really, I think, our biggest concern. And you know, it's always too late, right? We won't know it until we see it. I think back to Rappaport's waves, right? And people say, well, when is this current wave going to peter out? But I don't think it's not binary, right? It's not one or the other. We could have a lot of these things happening at the same time and kind of be overwhelmed by them.
I mean, just a couple of quick points before we open it up in response to what you've just said. In terms of environmentalism, I think one of the most striking things for me about the Christchurch attacks was Brenton Tarrant's self-description as an eco-fascist. And I'd not previously been aware of like the extreme right trying to claim environmentalism, you know, on 8chan, etc. You know, this is not just an issue for the, you know, for the left, but on the left. I mean, from a European perspective, left-wing terrorism doesn't sound very new at all. In fact, you know, if you go back, you know, I mean, I know that, you know, this isn't, you know, this isn't news to anybody on the platform, but most terrorism in the 1970s in Europe was left-wing, was Marxist-Leninist or Maoist, or, you know, or one of those flavors. And there are plenty of those Marxist-Leninist groups, you know, still out there.
They're mostly in faculty, I think, right now at universities.
But before we get even more controversial, let's open it up to the floor. There's a question from Alex. If you could just briefly say, I know who you are, but if you could say who you are, then that'd be great.
Alex Corbet, Government of Canada, Public Safety Canada. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is issues of social polarization, particularly white supremacy, kind of far-right attacks as well. And it's quite interesting. We had an attack in Canada in January of 2017 on a mosque that was carried out. Subsequently, it was released, the sort of media environment, the things that this individual was ingesting before. Some of it was terrorist content or violent extremist content. Some of it was mainstream right-wing political content from the US and France as well, too. And it kind of raises the question in that sort of context, also the context of New Zealand as well, with the individual there describing himself as an ethno-nationalist eco-fascist. These changes that in both cases, the Quebec mosque attack and also in terms of New Zealand, they're pointing to actual things. Demographic changes in Canada, a number I'll give you is 2006, 80% of the Canadian population was white. By 2106, it'll be the reverse. And that's a positive change. The issue becomes is when people go online and they start to kind of engage with sort of content that is very fear-mongering, that's not necessarily violent extremists, not necessarily inciting for violence, but they're looking at that sort of content. They're looking at sort of content that also encourages them to carry out violence as well. My question to the panel is, how do you think governments and tech companies can work better, not only to push kind of counter-narratives or counter-content to these sort of individuals, but I would think in a lot of these cases, these individuals themselves who have fear about women or fear about minorities, how do you think that governments and tech companies can work together to try to have better engagement between individuals who are potentially at risk and people who come from the communities that they're unnecessarily fearful about?
That's a very searching question. Go on, Bill.
There's always going to be this problem because as the tech companies are going to increasingly expand what they are either taking down or banning, there's the whack-a-mole. They're going to be on other platforms. And so if you're Soldiers of Odin or La Meute in Canada, you don't need to be on Facebook. You're going to have your own, bubble. And it's what Mark Sageman used to talk about, the echo chamber. And these echo chambers make even the coordination between governments and the social media companies moot, because you're going to have a new company that comes in, whether 4chan, you get kicked off 4chan, you end up on 8chan, you get off 8chan, there may in the future be a 16chan. So the question then becomes, to what extent we can even limit the free speech and the opportunities for these people to bounce ideas off each other. One of the things that Paul Gill had said, it echoes work that Max Taylor did years ago about pedophilia, but a lot of the people who are online looking at this material are people who themselves are never going to abuse a child, that there's some sort of strange living vicariously through the images. And so we don't know that there's a direct correlation between exposure to the images and action. And in fact, the absence of the exposure to the images could lead to action. What we don't have is we don't have a firm understanding of the pathways, so that we can rely on government, tech companies, collaborations. But at the end of the day, we can't take away the agency from the individuals who are then pursuing violent strategies or pathways. And this is where I'm always about empowering the individual. You can create as much context and construct as many environmental conditions that to increase the likelihood of someone choosing a violent path, but at the end, it's still the individual who's making the choice. And I don't know if I answered your question, but I definitely tried.
And sorry, just to add to that as well, too, what about the larger social polarization?
Sorry, Alice, can you hang on for a microphone?
Apologies. What about the larger social polarization aspect as well? I mean, whether or not someone will carry out violence, they may tend to support organizations that call for things that maybe aren't violent, but they're hateful in nature, et cetera, whether they be political organizations or community groups or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on some of this earlier, but I think in crowded marketplaces like the 24-hour news media or social media environment, there's this tendency to move towards highly variegated goods, where you've got one news channel that caters to its audience and another news channel that caters to its audience. And what happens is, instead of having the town commons or the place for diversity of opinion, you've got lots of places with very narrow sort of sets of opinions constantly being reinforced. And I think the challenge is that in the news media, the business model, I think, is to sell anger at the people in the other, watching the other channel, because you got to get you coming back and back. And people talk about selling fear, but I think it's actually anger that gets people coming back, right? You have to have somebody to get angry at, and that's really, really dangerous, right, for social cohesion. So what do I think private sector organizations can do, whether that's traditional media, new media? We have to figure out a way to celebrate the middle, celebrate diversity, not condemn compromise as a sin in our political discourse, right? To compromise with the other party is, like to be blacklisted, and that can't be the case if we're actually to not sort of fall victim to polarization. So whatever companies can do to, one, anticipate polarizing events and behaviors, including attacks, which are quite polarizing. We know that hate crimes spike massively in the 24 to 36 hours after a perceived act of international terrorism. Is there something that can be done in those high-risk moments to tweak the algorithm, so to speak, so that we're not allowing this really divisive polarization to take root, right? So again, counterterrorism to me is not about stopping the next attack. There will be a next attack. The KKK is 150 years old. It's about mitigating the psychological and political impact of the next attack. And if we can reduce the payoff for the next attack, right? If we can reduce the payoff for the next attack, we've reduced the incentive for violence as the form of empowerment that people pursue. I don't know how to operationalize that.
It's a great challenge.
Just a comment on, we need to celebrate diversity. I agree, that's my personal belief, but when we celebrate diversity, you see that driving anger in certain circles, because that's not the way it's always been. And why are we talking about this? And why are people telling me their pronouns, right? That's driving a certain anger there's the get off my lawn crowd, and then there's the extreme, right? People that are gonna be so angry about, and frankly, politicians tap into that because they know that it plays. And I completely agree with, the angry model, right? The selling and the polarization on cable news. I think you're right. It's tearing up social cohesion, and I don't know what the government or what the private sector can do to the extent that that's even their business to get involved with that. I mean, I think it is, but when everything revolves around profit, that's kind of it's a perverse logic.
I just wanted to add to something relevant to Canada. Canadian freedom of speech law is far more limited than the United States. It's much closer to the UK. So you're less likely to encounter it in Canada than we are in the United States, in part because you have CTV and CBC. You have governments in the same way that UK has BBC. Here, a lot of it is driven by profit. And if it's driven by profit, you're actually incentivized to exacerbate every story. You know, there was an event just by accident. A taxi driver was taking a medication and accidentally at the airport, plowed into the terminal. Didn't hit anybody, but he passed out. And it was assumed to be terrorism until it was proven otherwise. 20 years ago, you didn't lead with the assumption of something, because we know from media studies, if there is a story about terrorism, everyone watches the news. On an average day, the news is getting about a 22% Nielsen market share. If, God forbid, something happens and there's a terrorist attack, they get a 90% market share. So again, the news have their own perverse incentives to not just have clickbait online, but also create these narratives so that you will definitely tune in. And it's what Bill is saying. It's about being angry and fearful.
And when we're not focused on terrorism, we're focused on other things that matter, like the war on Christmas or the war on Hawaiian pizza, right? The latter, which I can get behind.
But this does underline one of the themes that I think has come out of the day, which is that it's perverse to focus on, if you like, new technology companies when we're talking about a communications environment that's much, much bigger than that. And if you like, the polarization of cable news in this country, which followed on, as far as I know, from a very conscious regulatory decision by the government, which I suppose makes the US very different, for example, from the UK. But that's probably a rabbit hole I shouldn't dive down. There's now a couple of questions. Gentleman halfway up, I think you were the first, and then there's one right at the back.
Thank you. My name is Christopher Harmon. Wonderful panel. I want to go back to the eco-terrorism question just for a minute. I think Mr. Braniff and the chair will be glad to know that at the graduate school I teach here, Institute of World Politics, I just gave a half-hour lecture 2 nights ago on the Unabomber Manifesto. So I'm with you. However, my question is, do you think, can you explain what appears to have been a peak in that kind of terrorism here in the U.S.? I haven't tracked it that closely, but I think the stats will show a rise all through the 90s, a peak right about 2000. Then there was a series of arrests, and perhaps law enforcement's the answer, but it seems to me it peaked, and now it seems to me in the last 2 decades, it's been really quiet, at least in the U.S., compared to the 90s. So can anyone explain that? Because I agree with you on the importance of the issue and its likelihood for the future.
Sorry, but you said eco-terrorism and then you said the Unabomber. So those to me are 2 different things, right? So one's the kind of neo-Luddite anti-technology and the other's environmental. So which?
He's both.
Okay.
Yeah, the journals, the letters, and the manifesto of 35,000 words will show you that he's both. And in fact, he also says he's an anarchist.
Yeah, so that he's got a lot going on there. Yeah, I'm not going to touch that. No, I mean, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think, again, if there's this growing perception that artificial intelligence or technology is really taking people's jobs, then, you know, that could very well drive what we're seeing. If it changes fundamental economic patterns in this country and it puts certain industries out, you know, that's what people will respond to. I don't think we've necessarily seen that or experienced that, and that's why. And I think the same thing with climate change. It's not necessarily new, but it's certainly got much more attention now, and it's also become a partisan issue, which is crazy because it's science, but that's where we are. And so if we keep trending toward that direction, right, I don't know, like I can't explain the peaks and troughs of what motivates people to engage in political violence, but I think those are 2 things, like I mentioned, that we very well could see looking forward. I can't say 7 years, 10 years. I think sooner rather than later, though.
And at the back? Yeah.
Hello. Emerson Brooking, Atlantic Council. I have a question for everyone, but particularly Dr. Bloom, and it's about children. So the San Diego synagogue shooter was 19, but he'd been lurking on 8chan since he was at least 17. BuzzFeed yesterday profiled a girl of 14 who has tens of thousands of young fans, very talented YouTuber, but a lot of her content regards genocide against Muslims. So I'm wondering, as we think more and more about far-right radicalization in this country and children at risk, what lessons we can draw from studies of children and Islamic terrorism that are applicable here. Thank you.
So the issue with youth, and again, not to use a trope, that children aren't born hating, they have to be taught, they have to learn to hate others. This is not a natural state of being. And actually, I think you tweeted the link, so I read the story as well. So thanks, Emerson. And I think she has 200,000 followers. It's more than tens of thousands. She actually has closer to almost 200,000. And part of it is that it's this culture of the selfie and attention seeking. And so I think that in some of these instances, obviously not the synagogue shooter in California, but in some of these instances, some of the youth are pushing the envelope just for the shock value because they're going to get more attention. So they are attention seeking. It's juxtaposed against a culture in which we see a lot of children that are bullied. We see that there isn't a lot of support in the schools. If a teacher tries to do something to support a child against bullies, the bully's parents are going to sue the school. So we're living in a very weird environment for youth. And so on the one hand, there's this anomie. There's the isolation that has been partially the result of a heavy reliance on social media. The fact that we see differences between boys and girls, that the validation of the likes, of the retweets, at the same time that social media is used occasionally to bully people into even sometimes committing suicide. So I don't know if, again, it's going to sound trite to say good parenting, more involvement of the parents. You know, the study that was done in 2007 and 8, many of you guys know that a bunch of Somalis disappeared from Minnesota. Now, these were not low achieving. One had just got into Harvard. And so these were high achieving. When the study was done by Steve Wine and others about what was the context, they spent many hours a day by themselves. It was usually a single parent family. The mother was working. And so they're sitting there with the internet, and for some reason, that isolation, those hours of idle hands, if you will, made them more susceptible. So I think that, part of it is to inoculate the kids against what can potentially be the adverse effects of too much time online. But at the same time, we have to understand that if the children are regurgitating or reiterating what they hear from the adults, they are parroting. So this is what I saw with Islamic State. I don't believe that the 4-year-old fully understands ISIS ideology, but I do believe that the 4-year-old is able to parrot what the parents say. So we also have to have a cognizance that these children are very easily influenced by people around them, and especially the parents. So that girl, the 12-year-old girl who's an internet star and is talking about people from Latin America and talking about Muslims and talking about killing Muslims, I would say she needs a spanking, but I think I'm told you're not allowed to do that anymore, right? Okay. We do have to have better parenting. We have to have more hands-on. We have to have the opportunity to have early intervention so that this doesn't spiral out of control. And then, of course, the media companies can come in and say, this is not an acceptable video to be hosting.
We have time for just one more and a hand shot up instantly. So please, madam.
Hi, Paula Kerr, retired Department of Army civilian. Bill, you started to say something about 8chan and then you lost your batteries or something. I've heard that this 8chan is wild. It sounds like ISIS, and 4chan, you said it might be pushed to the street. Did you mean pushed to the dark web where they're encrypted, or what?
Thank you for jogging my memory. So there's this phenomenon, right? When we push people off open social media, they go to lesser open social media. And when we push people on lesser social media, open social media platforms, they go to sort of more encrypted channels because they've already made the community, right? So the 11,000 individuals on Gab, they're already part of the community, and Gab becomes, instead of an outreach tool, or as Brian Fishman would say, an audience development tool, it becomes a community maintenance tool. Right? I already have my community. I just need to maintain them through active engagement. And one wonders, and what I was sort of speculating is, if we force people off of the lousy open channels like Gab, are we removing a release valve where they get to blow off steam in a not so secure environment where we can continue to have eyes on, and push them? I didn't mean to an encrypted platform. What they were saying on 8chan was, at first there was like reticence. Oh no, 8chan is gonna get shot down, and then it was good, because we need to finally get offline and get out in the real world. They meant get on the street. And so, if you remove the release valve, might you be removing a safety net of sorts for a community that's already bought in but can't really do effective recruitment because they're in somewhat of a closed environment where they don't have great outreach into the general population? And I don't know if I believe that. It's just something I've been sort of thinking about when I saw how excited some individuals were about the chance of getting kicked off, because it would finally almost remove the excuse for not engaging in direct action.
And the other thing I was wondering, and you mentioned electrical grids. I believe a country or two has already gotten into our electrical grid. They didn't do anything about it. I'm sure they're afraid of retaliation. What is the chance that a country that's not afraid of a retaliation or a terrorist group gets in the electrical grid and, hey, maybe the ATMs are closed or something? I don't know.
Honestly, I think that the best way to destroy our electrical grid is to just leave it alone and let it peter out. It's really poor infrastructure. You know what I mean? Is it Infrastructure Week?
It's Infrastructure Week again.
I didn't get the email. So, yeah, I think it's in such poor condition and so dilapidated that just leave it to its own devices. Why call attention to that? I don't know. And, the question that I often wonder is, what's the proportionate response, right? So, if there is a massive cyber attack by a state actor, or Russia, China, some nation that's got a return mailing address, can you respond kinetically, right? And this is all things that are being developed now in international law, and this is a very gray area. I'm not an expert in this area, but these are, we have to figure this out before it happens. And I think just in the most recent, let's see, Israeli-Hamas clashes, right?
Stuxnet.
Yeah, Stuxnet. But the Israelis responded kinetically to, I believe, to a Hamas cyber attack, right? And so, are you setting precedent? What happens there? And I mean, that's an open question to the other panelists as well.
Well, I'm afraid I set myself two objectives for this session. One was to stay awake, which I think I've achieved. Not that there was any difficulty with the quality of contributions from my left, but the second objective was to bring it in on time at 5:30.
Andrew's battery is dying.
So without the opportunity to kind of come back to that question, I just want to finish by thanking the three of you. As Bill suggested, the three of you aren't actually part of the Global Research Network on Terrorism and Technology. It's been very good of you to close our conference today with your expert thoughts. And the three of you are amongst actually a community of people who are, if you like, not formally part of the network, but have given up, your time and your service, if you like, to helping us through peer review, through joining selection panels for selecting our projects, and for providing expert advice on the way. So I would personally like to thank you particularly for your contributions today. And I'm sure the rest of the audience will join me in thanking the panel for an excellent session.
Okay, so we have, I will be very brief, just in some closing remarks, but I just want to offer a few thanks. So if you can, I realize I'm between you all and dinner or drinks, but I just want to offer thanks to the panelists who have come. Many of them have come quite a long way and are significantly jet lagged, as Andrew pointed out. I also want to thank our partners, the Gift CT, or the supporters for the Gift CT, as well as Facebook for its participation today. And there's also two people in particular that I want to offer a lot of thanks to. It takes a lot of work to put on something like this and to coordinate, international flights, et cetera. So I want to thank Aditya Dave for his tireless efforts to help put this on from RUSI. And then from Brookings, I'm gonna put Isra on the spot. She has been tireless. The only challenge greater than trying to coordinate a whole, over a dozen international flights is navigating the Brookings bureaucracy to put on an event, and Isra has been fantastic at that, so I want to really thank you, Isra, for all your work and support in this event. And then the final thanks, of course, is to you all. I believe there was a comment earlier about how some of the platforms were beginning to cull the kind of mainstream supporters from the hardcore. I think we have gone through a similar process today. Those of you who are still here are clearly the hardcore, true blue for tech and terrorism. So thank you for sticking around. Thank you for engaging with us. Thank you for your thoughts. With that, I will let you all go and say thanks once again. Oh, yes.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.